Meryl Streep stood in the entrance of Manhattan's most prestigious pet emporium, her faded gardening clothes and soil-stained hands a stark contrast to the Italian marble floors and crystal chandeliers that surrounded her. The afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the gold-plated fixtures and creating an almost ethereal glow throughout the establishment. Her simple linen shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms that had just hours ago been deep in the soil of her home garden, while her comfortable, worn pants and practical shoes seemed almost rebellious against the opulence that enveloped her. A woman in a pristine white designer suit watched her with undisguised contempt, unable to hide her disdain for what she perceived as an intruder in her world. Victoria Harrington, known throughout Manhattan's elite social circles for her perfectly curated wardrobe and carefully documented life on social media, tightened her grip on her crocodile Birkin bag as she observed the seemingly ordinary woman who had wandered into the exclusive space. The emporium was buzzing with its usual prestigious clientele. Women with immaculately styled hair examined diamond-studded collars while discussing their summer plans in the Hamptons. Men in tailored suits consulted with staff about rare exotic breeds, their voices authoritative and expectant. The gentle notes of a Bach concerto played from hidden speakers, complementing the atmosphere of refined luxury. In the midst of this carefully orchestrated display of wealth and status, Meryl moved with a quiet grace that seemed almost out of place. She passed by glass enclosures housing the world's most expensive cat breeds, her eyes registering not their monetary value, but the alertness in their expressions, the health in their coats. Her fingers, still bearing traces of the rich soil from her garden, lightly touched the glass as a Maine Coon kitten approached, curious about this human who carried the scent of the outdoors rather than expensive perfume. "Excuse me," a staff member said, approaching another customer nearby. "Would your Pomeranian prefer the Swarovski-encrusted water bowl or the hand-painted ceramic from Milan? We just received both collections this morning." Victoria made a small noise of disapproval as she watched Meryl move deeper into the emporium, leaving slight smudges of soil on the pristine glass. How had this gardener even made it past the doorman? The security in this place was clearly slipping. She adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet and decided to keep an eye on this unusual visitor, certain that at any moment a staff member would, politely but firmly, escort her back to the street where she belonged. What Victoria didn't notice was the subtle shift in the atmosphere as several employees exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of recognition and uncertainty. One young woman behind the counter whispered something to her colleague, who quickly glanced up and then returned to assisting a customer with selecting between two nearly identical leashes, both priced higher than a month's rent in most Manhattan apartments. Meryl continued her unhurried exploration, eventually finding herself in front of a special viewing area set apart from the main floor. Behind the temperature-controlled glass stood a magnificent Tibetan Mastiff, its coat a rich chestnut color that seemed to capture all the warmth in the room. Unlike the other animals that were displayed to highlight their aesthetic value, this creature emanated a sense of ancient dignity. Its eyes, deep and knowing, met Meryl's with an intensity that spoke of wisdom beyond human comprehension. The small placard beside the viewing area was discreet but clear. "Champion Bloodline Tibetan Mastiff, price upon request." But those who frequented the emporium knew that this particular specimen was valued at $1.5 million, making it one of the most expensive dogs in the world. Victoria, who had followed at a distance, felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, the gardener woman would understand that she had wandered too far from her flower beds. This was the emporium's crown jewel, reserved for only the most elite customers to even view up close. Surely now a staff member would intervene. Instead, the Mastiff, which had remained aloof to most visitors, moved toward the glass where Meryl stood. Its powerful frame shifted with deliberate grace as it approached, eyes never leaving her face. There was something in this connection, something profound in the way woman and beast regarded each other, that made several nearby customers pause in their transactions to watch. Victoria's perfectly penciled eyebrows drew together in confusion and increasing irritation. What happened next would change everyone's perspective on true wealth and compassion forever, leaving the entire establishment in stunned silence, Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy heartwarming stories about celebrities who remain grounded despite their fame and success, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story that will touch your soul. Now let's return to that fateful afternoon in Manhattan's most exclusive pet emporium. The Mastiff pressed its massive head against the glass, directly in front of where Meryl's soil-stained hand rested. Several gasps echoed through the now quieting space. The dog, which had shown indifference to billionaires and celebrities alike, seemed drawn to this seemingly ordinary woman in gardening clothes. "That's quite enough," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere as she strode forward, designer heels clicking authoritatively against the marble floor. "This area is reserved for serious clients." Her words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. She positioned herself between Meryl and the viewing area, her back to the older woman as if to physically block her from the prestigious animal's view. The movement was calculated, a social maneuver Victoria had perfected in years of navigating Manhattan's elite circles. "The sign clearly states, 'Price upon request,'" Victoria continued, her voice carrying just enough to ensure those nearby could hear. "And I doubt very much that—" She turned, ready to deliver the final blow that would surely send this gardener shuffling back to whatever community garden she had wandered in from. But as Victoria faced Meryl fully for the first time, something in the older woman's eyes, a depth of character, a quiet confidence, made her momentarily falter. The Mastiff, as if sensing the confrontation, moved to maintain its position opposite. Meryl, completely ignoring Victoria despite her proximity to the glass. A flicker of annoyance crossed Victoria's perfectly made-up face. Even this animal was failing to acknowledge her importance. The tension in the emporium was palpable. Customers and staff had become an audience to a drama unfolding between old money and new, between authentic presence and carefully constructed image, between a woman who had dirt under her fingernails and one who would never allow such an imperfection. No, one could have predicted what would happen in the next few moments. A revelation that would leave Victoria Harrington questioning everything she thought she knew about status, wealth, and true class. The Manhattan Pet Emporium pulsed with exclusive energy, a carefully orchestrated symphony of wealth and status. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic patterns across Italian marble floors, so pristine one could almost see their reflection. The air was infused with a subtle blend of sandalwood and lavender, a custom fragrance designed exclusively for the establishment at $800 per ounce, a fact the owner mentioned casually to preferred customers. Impeccably dressed, clientele moved through the space with practiced confidence. A television actress examined jewel-encrusted cat collars, while her assistant documented each option on an iPad. A hedge fund manager consulted with a nutrition specialist about his Pomeranian's custom meal plan. A well-known fashion designer's wife compared notes with a socialite about the benefits of different dog spas in the Hamptons, their designer handbags swinging gently as they gestured. "Portia simply won't go to Bark and Bubbles anymore," the socialite confided, the diamonds on her fingers catching the light as she adjusted her Hermes scarf. "Their organic oatmeal treatment simply isn't what it used to be." In the midst of this carefully curated display of affluence, Meryl Streep moved with a different rhythm entirely. Her attention remained fixed not on the luxury surrounding her, but on the animals themselves. She paused to watch a pair of Russian blues stretching languorously in their glass enclosure, noting the healthy shine of their coats and the alert intelligence in their eyes. Victoria Harrington maintained her position near the Tibetan Mastiff viewing area, one manicured hand resting possessively on the glass as she observed Meryl with growing irritation. Victoria had spent years cultivating her image in Manhattan's elite circles. Her Instagram account, with its carefully filtered photos of charity galas and yacht weekends, had nearly 500,000 followers. Her reputation for knowing exactly which designers to wear before they became trendy was unmatched among her social set. "Victoria, darling," called a woman in a cream-colored suit, her platinum bob swinging as she approached. "I didn't expect to see you here today. Weren't you flying to Palm Beach this morning?" "Changed my plans, Elise," Victoria replied, her eyes never leaving Meryl. "Something more interesting came up." Elise followed Victoria's gaze, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of the woman in gardening clothes. "How did she even get in?" Elise whispered. "Frederick is usually so good about maintaining the appropriate atmosphere." Victoria's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "An oversight I'm sure will be corrected shortly." Across the emporium, Meryl had made her way back to the Tibetan Mastiff's viewing area. The magnificent animal watched her approach, its posture alert yet calm. Standing before the glass enclosure, Meryl seemed completely unaware of the whispers and glances directed her way. The Mastiff was truly spectacular, over 150 pounds of dignified power, with a coat the color of burnished copper that shimmered under the specialty lighting. Its bloodline traced back to the guardians of Tibetan monasteries, a heritage reflected in the ancient wisdom of its gaze. The $1.5 million price tag attached to this particular specimen was justified by its rare coloring, perfect conformation, and championship lineage. Meryl placed her palm against the glass, soil still embedded in the fine lines of her skin. The Mastiff mirrored her action, pressing its massive paw to the same spot. The connection between them was palpable, transcending the barrier of glass and social convention. A young staff member approached, his tailored uniform immaculate but his expression uncertain as he took in Meryl's appearance. "Can I assist you with anything, ma'am?" he asked, his tone carefully balanced between professional courtesy and subtle questioning. Before Meryl could respond, Victoria glided over, Elise following in her wake. The scent of Victoria's exclusive French perfume, $900 per bottle, and available only through a private buyer in Paris, announced her arrival. "I believe this woman might be lost, James," Victoria said, her voice pitched to carry just far enough for nearby customers to hear. "Perhaps she's looking for the community garden center a few blocks away." James shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two women. "I'm sorry, but it's a magnificent animal," Meryl said, her attention still focused on the Mastiff. Her voice was warm and rich, carrying the kind of natural authority that needed no volume to command attention. "There's something almost mythological about the breed, don't you think? Like they've walked straight out of an ancient legend." Victoria's smile tightened. "The Tibetan Mastiff is indeed exceptional. This particular specimen comes from the world's most prestigious bloodline. His grandfather sold for $2 million at auction in China." She adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet. "They're considered a status symbol among those who can afford them, of course." "Status symbols," Meryl repeated thoughtfully, finally turning to face Victoria. "Interesting how we decide what gives us status, isn't it?" There was something in her gaze, a depth of understanding, a quiet confidence, that momentarily unsettled Victoria. The Mastiff had moved as close to the glass as possible, its attention entirely focused on Meryl despite Victoria's proximity. "This particular breed requires extensive care," Victoria continued, regaining her composure. "The grooming alone costs thousands monthly, not to mention the specialized diet and training. It's quite the commitment beyond just the initial investment. I imagine any relationship worth having requires commitment," Meryl responded. Her soil-stained hands rested comfortably at her sides, a stark contrast to Victoria's carefully manicured appearance. The tension between them was interrupted as Miss Peterson, the Emporium's owner, emerged from a back office. Her sharp eyes scanned the floor, taking in the scene by the Mastiff's enclosure. She paused, her expression shifting subtly before she began making her way toward them. "The Tibetan Mastiff isn't for everyone," Victoria said, lowering her voice to a confidential tone as if sharing insider knowledge. "They require a certain environment, a proper home with adequate space and staff. These aren't animals that belong in an apartment or small garden property." Meryl's eyes crinkled slightly. "At the corners, I find that animals, much like people, thrive less on the grandeur of their surroundings and more on the authenticity of the connection they form with those around them." The Mastiff chose that moment to press its massive head against the glass, directly in front of Meryl, completely ignoring Victoria. The gesture wasn't lost on the small audience that had gathered discreetly nearby, pretending to examine luxury pet accessories while watching the exchange. Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly. What was it about this gardener that commanded such attention? Even the $1.5 million dog seemed entranced by her presence. Miss Peterson was only a few steps away now, her expression unreadable as she approached the growing tension between old money and new, between authenticity and appearance, between the woman who had arrived in a chauffeured car and the one who carried the earth on her hands. What happened next would challenge everything Victoria thought she knew about value, worth and true class. Miss Peterson slowed her approach, her experienced eyes taking in the scene before her. Years of catering to Manhattan's elite had given her an intuitive sense for the delicate social dynamics unfolding in her establishment. For now she chose to observe from a strategic distance, giving a subtle signal to her staff to stay alert, but not intervene. Victoria positioned herself more directly between Meryl and the Tibetan Mastiff's enclosure, her Louboutin heels planted firmly on the marble floor. The movement was deliberate, a physical manifestation of her desire to reclaim control of the situation. "You seem quite interested in our premium collection," Victoria said, her voice dripping with condescension. She gestured toward the Mastiff with a perfectly manicured hand. "This particular breed has a lineage that can be traced back through Tibetan nobility. The asking price is $1.5 million, but that's really just the beginning of the investment." Several nearby customers had abandoned all pretense of shopping, now openly watching the exchange. Victoria was playing to this audience, her voice carrying just enough to ensure her words reached attentive ears. "The proper care for a Tibetan Mastiff requires specialized knowledge," she continued. "Their diet alone costs thousands monthly. Imported organic proteins, specific vitamin supplements. Then there's the grooming regime, the training with specialized handlers. It's quite the commitment." Meryl's eyes remained on the magnificent animal, who had refused to shift its attention from her, despite Victoria's attempts to dominate the space between them. "Every relationship requires commitment," Meryl responded simply. There was something in her voice, a warmth, a depth of experience, that caused several listeners to lean in slightly. Victoria's smile tightened. "Indeed. But some commitments require resources that aren't available to everyone. This isn't like adopting a rescue from the local shelter." The words hung in the air, their implication clear. A woman in Chanel nearby exchanged glances with her companion. Even by the Emporium's exclusive standards, Victoria's comments pushed the boundaries of acceptable rudeness. "I've always found that animals are remarkably good judges of character," Meryl said, finally turning to face Victoria directly. "They see past our packaging, don't they? Past the labels and price tags we humans find so important." As if on cue, the Mastiff shifted its massive weight, deliberately moving away from where Victoria stood, to position itself directly aligned with Meryl once again. The movement wasn't lost on the watching customers, several of whom exchanged meaningful glances. Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly. "Well, personal philosophies aside, these animals are bred for discerning clients. There's a reason they come with such a significant price tag." "I'm curious," Meryl responded, her weathered hands clasped casually before her, soil still visible beneath her nails. "What exactly does that price buy? Beyond the animal itself, what does $1.5 million actually purchase?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple, yet somehow challenging the very foundation of the Emporium's existence. A young couple, who had been considering a pair of rare Persian kittens, shifted uncomfortably, suddenly self-conscious about their presence in the establishment. Victoria's laugh was sharp, cutting through the tension. "Status, of course, exclusivity, the knowledge that you possess something truly rare and valuable." She adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet. "Some things in life are meant to be aspirational, reserved for those who have achieved a certain position." "And you believe this magnificent creature is one of those things?" Meryl asked, her voice soft but carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the space between them. "Obviously," Victoria replied, gesturing toward Meryl's gardening attire, with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "These aren't animals for just anyone. They require the right environment, the right lifestyle." The Mastiff chose that moment to press its massive paw against the glass, directly in front of where Meryl stood, its intelligent eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. The gesture seemed almost defiant, contradicting. Victoria's assertion about the right lifestyle with silent eloquence. James, the young staff member who had approached earlier, hovered nearby, clearly uncertain whether to intervene. Ms. Peterson remained in her position of observation, her experienced eyes missing nothing of the exchange. Perhaps, Meryl suggested, what these animals truly need isn't measured in square footage or dollar signs. Victoria's patience visibly thinned. "Look," she said, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that nevertheless carried to those nearby. "I'm trying to save you some embarrassment. This isn't a petting zoo or a community garden. The animals here are investments." "Investments," Meryl repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, investments," Victoria continued, gaining momentum, "like fine art or rare wines. They appreciate in value, they confer status, they belong in homes that can showcase them properly." She glanced pointedly at Meryl's soil-stained pants. "Not in environments that would diminish their worth." A hushed silence fell over the nearby. Customers. Even by the standards of Manhattan's elite social circles, Victoria's comments had crossed a line. Elise, who had been watching from a few feet away, took a small step back, physically distancing herself from her friend's increasingly inappropriate behavior. Meryl's expression remained calm, but something shifted in her eyes. Not anger, but a profound sadness that was somehow more powerful than any retort could have been. "I see," she said simply. The Mastiff let out a low, resonant sound, not quite a bark, but a vocalization that seemed to express solidarity with the woman in gardening clothes who stood before its enclosure. The sound reverberated through the hushed emporium, causing several customers to jump slightly. Victoria, startled by the dog's sudden vocalization, took an instinctive step backward. Her heel caught on the polished marble, causing her to momentarily lose balance. She recovered quickly, but not before several observers had noticed her momentary vulnerability. "I believe," Meryl said, her voice gentle but firm, "I'd like to speak with someone about the adoption process for this particular dog." Victoria's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "Adoption? You can't be serious." Ms. Peterson chose that moment to step forward, her professional smile revealing nothing of her thoughts as she approached the increasingly tense situation. What happened next would forever change how everyone in the Emporium understood true value. As Victoria's carefully constructed world of status and appearance was about to collide with a reality she never saw coming. "Adoption procedures?" Victoria's voice rose an octave, drawing even more attention from the other patrons. "For a $1.5 million Tibetan Mastiff? Surely you're joking." She turned to Ms. Peterson with an expectant smile, certain the Emporium owner would quickly put this absurd situation to rest. The awkward silence that followed as Ms. Peterson simply nodded courteously at Meryl was not the response Victoria had anticipated. "Ms. Peterson," Victoria said, her voice taking on an edge of desperation, "perhaps you could explain to this gardener that the Tibetan Mastiff is not available for adoption like some common shelter mutt." Ms. Peterson's professional smile remained perfectly in place. "Every animal in our establishment finds its proper home through our carefully managed placement process, Ms. Harrington. We call it adoption because ultimately these magnificent creatures choose their companions as much as we select appropriate owners." Victoria's perfectly lined lips parted in surprise. This wasn't the support she had expected from someone whose establishment catered exclusively to Manhattan's elite. She regrouped quickly, her social training kicking in as she forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "How charmingly democratic," she said. "But surely there are financial prerequisites, background checks, home inspections." She gestured pointedly at Meryl's gardening attire. "Standards." The word hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Several customers shifted uncomfortably, the atmosphere in the Emporium growing increasingly tense. Elise had now fully retreated to examine a display of exotic fish, pretending to be absorbed in their vibrant colors rather than associated with Victoria's behavior. "Our standards are indeed exacting," Ms. Peterson replied, her voice maintaining its professional warmth, while her eyes conveyed something entirely different to Victoria. "We consider many factors when placing our animals." Meryl, who had been watching this exchange with quiet composure, turned her attention back to the Mastiff. The magnificent animal had pressed its massive head against the glass, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed almost human in its discernment. "Look," Victoria said, lowering her voice to what she clearly thought was a discreet level, but was in fact perfectly audible to those nearby. "I understand we're all trying to be politically correct here, but let's be realistic. That dog costs more than most people's homes. Its monthly maintenance alone would bankrupt someone who," she glanced at Meryl's soil-stained fingers, "clearly doesn't even prioritize basic manicures." A collective intake of breath rippled through the watching customers. Even in the rarefied atmosphere of Manhattan's most exclusive establishments, such naked snobbery was rarely displayed so openly. A woman in Valentino actually closed her designer handbag and moved toward the exit, unwilling to be associated with the scene unfolding before her. Miss Peterson's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Miss Harrington, perhaps—" "No, I think we need to be honest here," Victoria interrupted, her social filter dissolving as her frustration mounted. "This is getting ridiculous. That dog," she pointed at the Mastiff, "costs $1.5 million. Its grooming routine alone requires specialists from Japan who charge $10,000 per session. Its food is custom formulated by veterinary nutritionists with PhDs. She turned to face Meryl directly, her designer heels bringing her to a height advantage. She clearly intended to exploit. "And you want to what? Take it home to your community garden plot, keep it in your walk-up apartment, feed it grocery store kibble?" The Mastiff let out another low, resonant sound, somewhere between a growl and a bark. The noise reverberated through the hushed emporium, causing Victoria to jump slightly despite the glass barrier between her and the massive animal. "Animals have excellent intuition," Meryl said quietly, her first words since Victoria's tirade began. "They sense things about us that we often try to hide from each other." "Spare me the fortune cookie wisdom," Victoria snapped, her composure cracking further. "This isn't about intuition or spirit or whatever New Age nonsense you're selling. This is about reality, and the reality is you can't afford this dog." Ms. Peterson stepped forward, her professional demeanor finally showing signs of strain. "Miss Harrington, that's quite—" "No, it needs to be said," Victoria continued, her voice rising. "We're all thinking it. This woman walks in here looking like she just crawled out of a compost heap, and we're supposed to pretend she's a potential client for one of the most expensive animals in the world." She gestured expansively, playing to her audience. "What's next? Should we show her the rare Scottish fold kittens? Perhaps she'd like to see our collection of endangered exotic birds? Where exactly does this charade end?" The emporium had fallen, completely silent now, the background music seeming inappropriately cheerful against the tension that filled the space. Even the animals seemed to sense the charged atmosphere, many having retreated to the back of their enclosures, all except the Tibetan Mastiff, which remained pressed against the glass closest to Meryl, its intelligent eyes never leaving her face. "I understand your concern," Meryl said, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that somehow commanded more attention than Victoria's increasingly strident tone. "You believe value is measured in dollars and appearances." She placed her soil-stained hand against the glass, aligning her palm with the massive paw of the Mastiff on the other side. "But I've found that life teaches us different lessons about true worth, if we're willing to learn them." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "How wonderfully philosophical. I'm sure that perspective serves you well in your gardening. But here in the real world, some things actually do have objective value, and this dog's value is $1.5 million. She turned to James, who had been hovering nearby throughout the exchange. "Perhaps you could escort this woman to a more appropriate section. I believe the shelter downtown has a perfectly nice selection of rescue mutts available for adoption." The young staff member's eyes widened in alarm at being directly involved in the confrontation. He looked desperately toward Ms. Peterson for guidance, but before anyone could respond, the Tibetan Mastiff let out a bark so powerful it seemed to physically reverberate through the glass of its enclosure. The sound was commanding, undeniable, and clearly directed at Victoria. What happened next would leave everyone in the emporium questioning everything they thought they knew about wealth, worth, and the true nature of class. The Tibetan Mastiff's powerful bark still seemed to echo through the emporium. Though the magnificent animal had fallen silent, its intelligent eyes shifting between Victoria and Meryl with unmistakable discernment. The tension in the air was palpable, a nearly physical presence hanging over the assembled audience of Manhattan's elite. Ms. Peterson stepped forward, her professional smile finally abandoning her completely. "I think that's quite enough, Ms. Harrington," she said, her voice carrying a steel that had been absent from her previously cordial tone. Victoria's face flushed, a combination of embarrassment and indignation coloring her carefully contoured cheeks. "I'm simply stating what everyone is thinking," she insisted, glancing around for support that wasn't forthcoming. Even Elise had now completely disappeared from view, having retreated to the far corner of the Emporium. "Actually," came a voice from nearby, "I don't believe that's what everyone is thinking at all." All heads turned to see an elderly gentleman in a well-worn but impeccably tailored suit approaching. His silver hair and dignified bearing commanded immediate respect, but it was the quiet authority in his voice that silenced the room. Victoria recognized him instantly. Winston Blackwell, whose family had been Manhattan royalty since the Gilded Age. "Mr. Blackwell," Miss Peterson said, inclining her head respectfully. Winston Blackwell's attention, however, was focused entirely on Meryl. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice warm with genuine admiration. "I simply couldn't stand by any longer without expressing how refreshing it is to encounter someone who understands the true nature of these magnificent animals." Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her social programming momentarily short-circuiting at the sight of Winston Blackwell, whose family had an entire wing named after them at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Addressing the gardener with such deference, Winston turned to Victoria, his expression mild but his eyes sharp with assessment. "My dear, true class has never announced itself with labels or price tags. It has always been revealed through actions and character." The words, delivered without particular emphasis but with the weight of generations of genuine old money behind them, landed like a physical blow. Victoria physically recoiled, her designer heel catching on the polished marble once again. This time she actually stumbled backward, nearly colliding with a display of crystal pet bowls. A young sales assistant rushed forward to steady both, Victoria and the wobbling display, but the damage to her composure was already done. Several onlookers had witnessed her momentary gracelessness, and in the rarefied atmosphere of the Emporium, such a lapse felt catastrophic. Winston Blackwell turned his attention back to Meryl, seemingly oblivious to Victoria's distress. "My family has bred Mastiffs for 4 generations," he continued. "Not for show or status, but because we value their loyalty, intelligence, and discernment." He glanced at the magnificent animal still pressed against the glass near Meryl. "And they are indeed excellent judges of character." Victoria, desperate to regain control of the situation and her social standing, stepped forward once more. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a brittle edge of desperation beneath its forced lightness. "Mr. Blackwell, of course I meant no disrespect to the breed. I simply wanted to ensure that such a valuable animal would find an appropriate home with someone who could properly care for it." She gestured toward Meryl's gardening attire with a flick of her manicured fingers. "Surely you agree that certain standards should be maintained?" The silence that followed was excruciating. Winston Blackwell regarded Victoria with the kind of expression one might direct at a particularly disappointing child. "Standards," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I do believe in standards, Ms. Harrington. The question is whether we're referring to the same ones." Before Victoria could formulate a response, Ms. Peterson stepped forward again. "Perhaps we should allow our guest to continue her inquiry about the adoption process without further interruption." The emphasis she placed on the word guest was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her Louboutins. Somehow, in the space of a few minutes, the social hierarchy she had taken for granted had been completely upended. The gardener was being treated as an honored visitor, while she, Victoria Harrington, with her carefully curated wardrobe and social media following, was being gently but firmly put in her place. It was intolerable. It was incomprehensible. It was the breaking point. "This is absurd," Victoria said, her voice rising beyond the boundaries of acceptable volume for the refined setting. "We're standing here pretending that this woman," she gestured dismissively at Meryl, "could possibly provide an appropriate home for a $1. 5 million, dog, look at her. The Emporium fell completely silent. Even the gentle background music seemed to pause in embarrassment at the outburst. Victoria, realizing she had crossed a line but unable to retreat, plunged forward. She's wearing clothes from a thrift store, for God's sake. Her hands are covered in dirt. She probably rode the subway here. Are we seriously entertaining the notion that she can afford even the weekly grooming for this animal, let alone the purchase price? Miss Peterson's expression had hardened into something approaching granite. Winston Blackwell had drawn himself up to his full height, a formidable presence despite his advanced years. But it was Meryl who spoke, her voice quiet, yet somehow filling the entire space. Perhaps, she said, meeting Victoria's gaze directly, the price tag isn't the only measure of whether someone can properly care for another living being. There was something in her eyes, a depth of experience, a quiet wisdom that momentarily silenced even Victoria. The Tibetan Mastiff let out another sound, softer this time, almost like a sigh of agreement. Victoria backed into a corner, both literally and figuratively, lashed out with the desperation of someone watching their social standing crumble before their eyes. Oh, spare me the philosophical platitudes. This isn't a community theatre production where we all learn a valuable lesson about not judging books by their covers. She turned to Miss Peterson, her voice taking on a demanding edge. I insist that you escort this woman to the appropriate section for her budget. This charade has gone on long enough. Ms. Peterson's reply was cut short by the sound of a young sales assistant rushing forward, her eyes wide with recognition and excitement. She whispered something urgently in Ms. Peterson's ear, though her voice carried just enough for those closest to hear fragments. Realized who? Oscar winner, national treasure. The color drained from Victoria's face as a terrible suspicion began to dawn. The hushed whispers that suddenly erupted around the Emporium confirmed her worst fears, even before Miss Peterson turned with a genuine smile that transformed her entire countenance. What happened next would forever change how everyone in that room, especially Victoria Harrington, understood the true meaning of worth, status, and class. Ms. Streep, Ms. Peterson said, her voice carrying a warmth that had been entirely absent in her exchanges with Victoria, please accept our most sincere apologies for not recognizing you sooner. It's an absolute honor to have you in our establishment. The words fell like thunderclaps in the suddenly silent Emporium. Heads turned. Phones were discreetly raised. A collective intake of breath seemed to draw all the oxygen from the room at once. Meryl Streep. The name rippled through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped in still water. 3-time Academy Award winner, 21-time nominee, the most celebrated actress of her generation. A cultural icon whose talent and integrity had made her beloved worldwide. Victoria Harrington stood frozen, her perfectly manicured hand suspended mid-gesture, her face a study in dawning horror. The reality of what she had done, who she had been lecturing about worth and value, crashed over her like a tidal wave. Meryl Streep, she whispered, the name escaping her lips unbidden. For her part, Meryl's expression remained unchanged, the same quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout the confrontation. She acknowledged Ms. Peterson's greeting with a gentle nod, but kept her hand pressed against the glass where the Tibetan Mastiff's massive paw remained aligned with hers. Thank you, she said simply, but I'd prefer to continue our conversation about this beautiful animal, if that's all right. Winston Blackwell's eyes crinkled with amusement and something like vindication. I thought I recognized a kindred spirit, he said, his tone warm with genuine respect. My wife and I greatly admired your performance in Sophie's Choice, a masterpiece. A murmur of agreement swept through the Emporium. Several customers had abandoned all pretense of shopping, now openly watching the scene unfold with the rapt attention of an audience at one of Meryl's award-winning performances. Victoria struggled to process this seismic shift in reality. Her mind raced desperately, searching for some way to recover from what was rapidly becoming the most mortifying moment of her carefully curated life. She had just spent the last 20 minutes loudly insulting Meryl Streep, comparing her to a gardener, mocking her clothes, questioning her financial status and demanding she be escorted to an appropriate section for her budget. Meryl Streep, whose net worth was estimated at over $160 million. Meryl Streep, who owned multiple properties, including a luxurious Connecticut estate. Meryl Streep, who was known for her philanthropic work and commitment to numerous charitable causes. I had no idea, Victoria stammered, her voice barely audible. If I had known who you were, would it have made a difference? Meryl asked, echoing the question she had posed earlier. But now the words carried a weight that silenced the entire room. Should it make a difference? The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Several of the watching customers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own tendency to judge based on appearances rather than character. Ms. Peterson cleared her throat gently. Ms. Streep, would you like to continue discussing the adoption process for Thor? He seems quite taken with you. At the sound of his name, the magnificent Mastiff, Thor, let out a soft whine, pressing even closer to the glass that separated. Him from Meryl, I would, yes, Meryl replied, her attention returning to the animal. He's a remarkable creature. The staff rushed to open the viewing area, allowing Thor to approach Meryl directly. Without hesitation, the massive dog padded forward with surprising grace for his size, sitting obediently at Meryl's feet, as if he had been waiting his entire life for this moment. Victoria watched in mute humiliation as Meryl knelt, unmindful of her gardening clothes, and gently ran her soil-stained hands through Thor's luxurious coat. The Tibetan Mastiff, the $1.5 million status symbol that Victoria had been so certain required a certain type of owner, leaned into Meryl's touch with complete trust, his intelligent eyes half closed in contentment. I've been looking for a companion for my other rescues, Meryl explained to Miss Peterson. I have the space for him to run, and I think he'd enjoy the countryside. Winston Blackwell nodded approvingly. These animals thrive with room to roam. They were bred to guard Tibetan monasteries, after all. They need purpose and connection, not just luxury accommodations. Miss Peterson gestured to James, who had been hovering nearby throughout the confrontation. Please prepare the adoption paperwork for Miss Streep, she said, her tone making it clear that the process would be expedited with every courtesy. Victoria stood forgotten at the periphery of the gathering, her designer outfit and carefully styled hair suddenly seeming like an elaborate costume. Rather than markers of genuine status, she watched as Meryl Streep, dressed in simple gardening clothes with dirt under her fingernails, commanded the complete attention and respect of everyone in the room without effort or pretense. A terrible realization dawned on Victoria. Meryl didn't need designer labels or status symbols to assert her worth. Her quiet dignity, her genuine connection with Thor, her philosophical perspective on value, these were the markers of true class that Victoria had been desperately imitating, but never understanding. One of the customers, a young woman who had been documenting the entire encounter discreetly on her phone, caught Victoria's eye and quickly looked away, her expression a mixture of second-hand embarrassment and judgment. Victoria realized with a sinking feeling that this mortifying encounter might well end up on social media, the ultimate nightmare for someone whose carefully curated image was her entire currency. As the adoption paperwork was being prepared, conversations resumed around the Emporium, many centered on Meryl's filmography and charitable work. Victoria stood alone, invisible now that her social power had evaporated in the face of genuine celebrity and authentic character. Meryl remained, focused on Thor, seemingly uninterested in the stir her identity had caused. The Mastiff had placed his massive head in her lap, his eyes never leaving her face as she gently scratched behind his ears. You know, Winston Blackwell said, approaching Victoria with the kind of compassion that somehow made everything worse. In my family, we have a saying, true nobility is being superior to your former self, not to others. The words, kindly meant but devastating in their accuracy, were the final blow to Victoria's crumbling facade of superiority. She had spent her entire life trying to be better than others, while Meryl Streep, it seemed, had simply focused on being genuine. What happened next would reveal whether Victoria Harrington was capable of learning the most valuable lesson about true worth that life had ever offered her. Victoria retreated to a quiet corner of the Emporium, her face burning with a humiliation so profound it felt physical. She watched from her position of invisibility as staff members fawned over Meryl Streep, offering her refreshments that were politely declined, speaking in tones of deference that Victoria had always believed were reserved for people like herself. Thor remained glued to Meryl's side, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he followed her every step. The $1.5 million dog that had completely ignored Victoria's designer perfume and carefully practiced commands had bonded instantly with a woman in gardening clothes with soil beneath her fingernails. James returned with the adoption paperwork, his previous uncertainty replaced with eager attentiveness. "Mrs. Streep, we've prepared everything for Thor's adoption. We can arrange for our premium transportation service to deliver him to your residence tomorrow if that would be convenient." Meryl smiled, her hand resting comfortably on Thor's massive head. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary. I have my truck parked outside. If the paperwork's in order, I'd be happy to take him home today." Victoria nearly choked on the irony. Meryl Streep, legendary actress, cultural icon, multi-millionaire, drove a truck. And somehow, this detail made Victoria feel even more foolish about her own carefully maintained image and the Bentley waiting for her outside with a chauffeur on standby. Ms. Peterson appeared with what looked like a custom leather portfolio. "Everything is prepared, Mrs. Streep. We've included our comprehensive care guide for Thor, though I understand this isn't your first experience with the breed." "My third, actually," Meryl replied. "My first Mastiff was a rescue from a situation where his owner bought him as a status symbol without understanding the breed's needs. He lived with us for 12 wonderful years." The pointed nature of this comment wasn't lost on Victoria, who sank further into her corner, wondering if there was any way to exit the Emporium without being noticed. Her phone buzzed in her handbag, probably Elise, who had completely abandoned her once the social tide had turned. Several customers had gathered at a respectful distance, clearly hoping for an opportunity to speak with Meryl, a woman in Chanel, who had earlier exchanged knowing glances with Victoria over Meryl's appearance, now stood with an expression of unconcealed admiration, her designer shopping bag clutched to her chest like a shield. Thor looked up at Meryl with complete devotion, his intelligent eyes never leaving her face. The bond between them was already palpable, making nonsense of Victoria's earlier claims about the dog needing a certain type of owner. Winston Blackwell approached Meryl again, his manner respectful but comfortable in the way of someone accustomed to moving in elevated circles without being intimidated by them. "Mrs. Streep, if I might impose, I'd be honored if you would consider allowing Thor to meet with our female Mastiff. She has an impeccable bloodline, and more importantly, a wonderful temperament. Not for breeding purposes necessarily, but I believe they would enjoy each other's company." "I'd like that," Meryl replied with genuine warmth. "Animals need community, just as much as we do." Victoria watched this exchange with a strange mixture of emotions. The humiliation remained, burning beneath her perfectly applied makeup, but something else was emerging, a dawning recognition of what true confidence looked like. Neither Meryl nor Winston felt any need to assert their status or importance. They simply existed comfortably in their own skin, focusing on connections rather than impressions. From her position of social exile, Victoria began to see the Emporium through new eyes. The customers with their designer labels and carefully constructed personas suddenly seemed like actors in an elaborate performance, while Meryl Streep, ironically the actual actress, was perhaps the only authentic person in the room. Victoria's gaze drifted to her reflection in a nearby mirror, taking in her perfect blowout, her strategically selected outfit, her flawless makeup. For the first time, she wondered how much time she had wasted cultivating an image instead of developing character. How many genuine connections had she sacrificed at the altar of social status? Ms. Peterson was now explaining the Mastiff's dietary requirements to Meryl, who listened attentively, occasionally asking insightful questions that revealed her knowledge of the breed. Thor sat at her feet, patient and regal, occasionally pressing his massive body against her legs, as if to reassure himself of her presence. "He has a special organic meal plan developed by our in-house nutritionist," Ms. Peterson explained. "We can arrange for weekly deliveries to your home." Meryl nodded thoughtfully. I'd appreciate the details of his current diet. I work with a holistic veterinarian who helps me transition rescue animals to a natural diet based on what would be available in their ancestral environments. Another customer who had been hovering nearby stepped forward hesitantly. Ms. Streep, I just wanted to say that your work with animal rescue organizations has been an inspiration. I recently adopted a senior dog because of something you said in an interview about older animals having so much love to give. Meryl's face lit up with genuine pleasure. That's wonderful to hear. What kind of dog? Victoria watched as Meryl engaged with this stranger with the same authentic interest she had shown to everyone, regardless of their social status or designer labels. There was no performance, no calculation in her interactions, just genuine, human connection. The contrast with Victoria's own carefully calibrated social behaviors was stark and uncomfortable. She recalled how she had entered the Emporium earlier that day, noting who was important enough to acknowledge and who could be safely ignored. The memory now seemed petty and embarrassing. Thor had settled into his position beside Meryl, his magnificent coat gleaming under the Emporium's carefully designed lighting. Victoria remembered her earlier words about the dog requiring a certain environment and lifestyle to thrive. Looking at the animal's contentment in Meryl's presence, those assertions now seemed not just wrong, but fundamentally misguided. What Thor responded to, what everyone in the room responded to, wasn't Meryl's wealth or fame, but something more essential. Her authenticity, her compassion, her genuine interest in connection rather than status. A terrible question began to form in Victoria's mind. If she stripped away the designer clothes, the strategic social media presence, the carefully cultivated connections, what would remain? Who was she beneath the labels and status symbols she had used to define her worth? The question was uncomfortable, even painful, but as Victoria watched Meryl Streep, one of the most successful women in the world, happily discussing her truck and her garden, she wondered if it might be the most important question she had ever asked herself. The adoption paperwork was now complete. Thor would be going home with Meryl Streep. What Victoria couldn't have anticipated was that her own journey was just beginning, a journey toward understanding what truly matters, and perhaps toward becoming someone worthy of the respect she had always demanded, but never earned. As the adoption paperwork was being finalized, Victoria found herself at a crossroads, both literal and figurative. She could slip away unnoticed, preserving what little remained of her dignity, but missing the opportunity for something far more valuable. Or she could swallow her pride and do something genuinely difficult, perhaps for the first time in her carefully cultivated life. Thor had settled on the floor beside Meryl, his massive head resting contentedly against her soil-stained pants. The juxtaposition was striking. One of the world's most expensive dogs finding peace next to a woman who seemed completely unconcerned with displaying her wealth or status. Victoria took a deep breath, smoothed her designer dress with trembling hands and approached. The conversation around Meryl quieted as Victoria drew near, several onlookers watching with barely disguised curiosity to see how this uncomfortable encounter would unfold. "Ms. Streep," Victoria said, her voice smaller than she had ever allowed it to be in public. "I owe you an apology." Meryl looked up, her expression neither angry nor triumphant, merely attentive, present in a way that made Victoria feel truly seen, perhaps for the first time that day. "An apology isn't necessary," Meryl replied gently. "I think it is," Victoria insisted, finding unexpected strength in the admission of weakness. "Not because of who you are, but because of how I behaved. I was cruel and judgmental, and I'm deeply sorry for that." The Emporium had fallen silent, the audience to this unexpected act of contrition holding their collective breath. Even Thor seemed to sense the significance of the moment, his intelligent eyes moving between the two women. "May I?" Victoria gestured to the empty space beside Meryl on the bench, where she sat with the adoption papers spread before her. Meryl nodded, shifting slightly to make room. Victoria sat down carefully, acutely aware of the soil from Meryl's gardening clothes that might transfer to her $1,000 dress. The concern felt ridiculous now, a relic from a version of herself that already seemed distant. "I've spent my entire life," Victoria began, her voice gaining strength as she committed to honesty, believing that worth comes from things, from labels, from being recognized and envied. She glanced around the emporium, seeing it suddenly through new eyes. I've built my whole identity around being seen as someone special, because of what I own and who knows me. Meryl listened without interruption, her attention complete and genuine, the same quality of presence she brought to her award-winning roles, now focused entirely on Victoria. Watching you today, Victoria continued, with Thor, with everyone, I realized I don't know how to be authentic. I don't know who I am without all of this. She gestured vaguely at her designer outfit, her perfectly styled hair. And I think that's why I was so threatened by you. Even before I knew who you were, you seemed so comfortable in your own skin. A small smile played at the corners of Meryl's lips. It took me years to find that comfort, she said, surprising Victoria with this personal admission. In my profession, there's enormous pressure to be what others expect, to look a certain way, to say the right things, to maintain an image. She reached down to stroke Thor's head, her soil-stained fingers running through his luxurious coat. I discovered that the more I tried to meet those expectations, the further I got from myself, from what actually matters to me. Victoria nodded, a lump forming in her throat. How did you find your way back? Gradually, by asking myself what I would do if no one was watching, what would bring me joy even if it didn't photograph well for magazines. Meryl smiled, gesturing to her gardening clothes. Hence this. I was working in my garden this morning. Not for Instagram, not for anyone else. Just because feeling the earth between my fingers connects me to something real. Thor shifted his massive weight, pressing closer to Meryl's leg, as if affirming her words. The Mastiff's obvious preference for authenticity over appearance was a living demonstration of the lesson Victoria was struggling to absorb. I thought I was protecting my status by putting you down, Victoria admitted. The words physically painful to speak, but somehow liberating. But all I did was reveal how empty that status really is. Ms. Peterson approached with the final adoption, papers hesitating when she saw the intense conversation unfolding. Meryl nodded reassuringly, taking the documents, but indicating she needed a moment before signing. You know what I've found, Meryl said, turning back to Victoria. True confidence, the kind that doesn't need constant external validation, comes from being of value, not just having valuables. The distinction hit Victoria like a physical force. How much of her life had been dedicated to acquiring things? That signaled status, rather than developing qualities that added actual value to the world around her. I wouldn't even know where to begin, Victoria said, a rare vulnerability creeping into her voice. You already have, Meryl replied simply. This conversation, choosing honesty over pride, that's the beginning. Thor let out a soft sound, almost as if agreeing with Meryl's assessment. Several of the watching customers had moved closer, no longer pretending not to listen. There was something happening in this exchange that transcended celebrity sighting or social drama, something authentic and unexpectedly moving. I volunteer at an animal rescue center in Connecticut, Meryl said, her eyes lighting up with genuine passion. They always need help, especially people with organizational skills and social connections. Victoria blinked in surprise at this unexpected opening. Are you inviting me? If you're interested, Meryl replied with a shrug that somehow managed to be both casual and significant. Sometimes the best way to find yourself is by being of service to others. That's been my experience anyway. Victoria found herself nodding before she had consciously made the decision. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, she had responded to something without calculating its social advantage, without wondering how it would look on her carefully curated Instagram feed. The sensation was foreign but not unpleasant, like discovering a muscle she had never used before. Meryl smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached her eyes and somehow encompassed not just Victoria but everyone watching. She signed the final adoption paper with a flourish, officially making Thor hers. The Mastiff, as if understanding the significance of the moment, rose to his full impressive height and looked between the two women. Then, to Victoria's shock, He moved toward her and gently rested his massive head against her knee, the first acknowledgement he had given her in the entire time she had been in the Emporium. "Well, look at that," Meryl said softly. "Thor approves." Of new beginnings. Victoria tentatively placed her hand on the Mastiff's head, feeling the warmth and solidity of him beneath her manicured fingers. Something tight and constricted in her chest began to loosen, like a knot finally giving way after years of increasing tension. In that moment, surrounded by watching eyes but somehow more unseen than she had ever been, Victoria Harrington began to understand what Meryl Streep had known all along, that true worth wasn't something you displayed. It was something you lived. As Meryl completed the final adoption paperwork, the atmosphere in the Emporium had transformed entirely. What had begun as a temple to luxury and status had somehow become a space for authentic human connection. Customers who had earlier been studiously ignoring each other while comparing designer labels were now engaged in genuine conversation, many of them discussing their own experiences with rescue animals inspired by Meryl's example. Victoria remained seated, Thor's massive head still resting against her knee. She found herself absently stroking his ears, marveling at how something so simple could feel so profoundly comforting. The Mastiff's acceptance of her felt like absolution, unearned but freely given. "Ms. Streep," Ms. Peterson said, approaching with an elegant leather portfolio. "Everything is in order. Thor is officially yours." She handed Meryl a monogrammed key. "This opens his special travel crate in our premium transportation area." Meryl accepted the key with a grateful nod. "Thank you, though I suspect Thor would be just as happy riding in the back of my truck as he would in a fancy crate." As if to confirm this assessment, Thor let out a soft, contented sigh against Victoria's leg. "I can help you take him out," Victoria offered, surprising herself with the sincerity of the gesture. Just hours ago she would have considered such an offer beneath her, a task for staff rather than someone of her social standing. Now it felt like a privilege. "I'd appreciate that," Meryl replied, her smile warm and inclusive. Winston Blackwell approached, his dignified bearing somehow more impressive for its lack of ostentation. "Miss Streep, before you leave, I'd like to make a donation to the rescue center you mentioned." He handed her a business card embossed with the Blackwell family crest. "Please have them contact my office. Tibetan Mastiffs have been companions to my family for generations, and I believe in supporting those who understand their true value." He turned to Victoria, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps you might consider joining our foundation's annual charity gala for animal welfare. We're always looking for people with social media expertise to help spread awareness." Victoria blinked, in surprise. Winston Blackwell, whose family had helped build Manhattan, was inviting her to collaborate, not because of her designer clothes or carefully curated image, but because of a skill she could contribute to something meaningful. "I'd be honored," she replied, and meant it. As Meryl gathered her things, a young woman who had been hovering nearby finally worked up the courage to approach. Victoria recognized her as the one who had been discreetly filming earlier. Her stomach clenched in anticipation of the inevitable social media humiliation that awaited her. "Excuse me, Miss Harrington," the young woman said hesitantly. Victoria braced herself. "Yes? I just wanted to say—" The woman glanced down at her phone, then back up with unexpected earnestness. "What you did just now, apologizing and being vulnerable like that. It was really brave. I deleted all my footage. Some things shouldn't be shared for likes and views." The knot in Victoria's stomach loosened, replaced by a sensation so unfamiliar, it took her a moment to identify it. Genuine gratitude, untainted by calculation of social advantage. "Thank you," she said simply. As they prepared to leave, Ms. Peterson approached Victoria with something in her hand. "Ms. Harrington, I believe this belongs to you." She held out Victoria's diamond tennis bracelet, which must have fallen off during her earlier stumble. "It's quite valuable." Victoria stared at the bracelet, seeing it suddenly through new eyes. How many hours had she spent selecting it, making sure it was exactly the right balance of exclusive, yet recognizable? How often had she positioned her arm just so in photos to ensure it was visible, without seeming like she was showing off? "Actually," she said, making a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours before. "I'd like to donate this to the Animal Rescue Center Ms. Streep mentioned, if that's possible." Ms. Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. I'm sure they'll put it to good use." The gesture wasn't grand or performative. Victoria hadn't announced it loudly, or made sure others overheard. It was small, private, and more authentic than anything she had done in years. As they walked toward the exit, Thor padding majestically between them, Victoria felt strangely lighter. The diamond bracelet had been heavy in ways that had nothing to do with its physical weight. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the street. Victoria had expected to see Meryl's security detail, perhaps a chauffeur or at minimum a luxury vehicle. Instead, parked in a loading zone was an older model pickup truck, well-maintained but far from the vehicle one might expect for a Hollywood legend. "That's yours?" Victoria couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Meryl laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "For 20 years now, perfect for hauling garden supplies and rescuing dogs." She patted the truck's side affectionately. Not everything valuable looks impressive at first glance. Thor approached the truck with familiar enthusiasm, clearly recognizing it from Meryl's scent. With a surprisingly agile leap for an animal his size, he jumped into the back, where a comfortable-looking pad was already in place. "He seems to approve of your transportation choices," Victoria observed, a smile tugging at her lips. "Animals have excellent judgment about what actually matters," Meryl replied, her eyes twinkling. "So, the Animal Rescue Center, would next Saturday work for you? They're having a special adoption event for senior dogs. They're the hardest to place but often the most loving." Victoria nodded, realizing with some surprise that she was genuinely looking forward to it. "I'll be there. And I'll bring blankets. My condo building has a bunch in storage that were going to be thrown out. Would those be useful?" "Perfect," Meryl said with approval. "Those dogs will appreciate something soft and warm." As Victoria watched Meryl climb into her truck, Thor now settled happily in the back, she was struck by how differently she was seeing the world. Just hours ago, she had judged a woman in gardening clothes as unworthy of being in the same exclusive space as herself. Now she was seeing past surfaces to something more essential. The transformation wasn't complete. She knew that lasting change would require more than one afternoon's epiphany. But something had shifted fundamentally in how she understood value, worth, and her place in the world. Meryl rolled down her window before pulling away. "Victoria," she called, her expression thoughtful. "What happened today? It isn't about becoming someone new. It's about finding who you've always been, beneath all the things you thought you needed to be." With those words and a warm smile, Meryl Streep, Academy Award winner, cultural icon, and now owner of a $1.5 million Tibetan Mastiff, drove away in her practical pickup truck, leaving behind a woman who was taking her first steps toward measuring worth not by price tags, but by the capacity for connection, compassion, and authentic presence. Victoria stood on the sidewalk long after the truck had disappeared from view, feeling the first stirrings of something that felt remarkably like freedom. 1 week later, Victoria Harrington pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Connecticut Animal Rescue Center. Her luxury SUV looked distinctly out of place among the modest vehicles surrounding it. She had debated taking a rideshare instead, concerned that her car might create another barrier between herself and this new world she was tentatively entering. But authenticity, she was learning, wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about being genuine in who you were while remaining open to growth. She stepped out of her vehicle, dressed in what her stylist would have horrified to see: simple jeans, a comfortable sweater, and boots that could withstand mud and dog hair. A stack of blankets from her condo building sat neatly folded on her passenger seat. No designer labels, no statement pieces, no carefully curated accessories. It felt strange, like speaking a new language. The rescue center was a converted barn, set on several acres of fenced land. Dogs of various sizes and breeds played in designated areas, their barks and playful growls creating a soundtrack so different from the carefully selected ambient music of the Manhattan Pet Emporium. The sign above the entrance was simple wood, hand-painted with care rather than corporate precision: "Every animal deserves love." Victoria took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, fighting the instinct to check her appearance in her phone's camera. Today wasn't about how she looked. It was about what she could contribute. Inside, the center was bustling with activity. Volunteers in simple t-shirts moved purposefully, carrying food, bedding, and supplies. The walls were lined with photographs, not of pedigrees and championships, but of ordinary people with their adopted companions, faces alight with genuine joy. A large chalkboard announced, "Senior Dog Adoption Day. Help our golden oldies find their forever homes. Victoria." "You made it." The voice was warm and instantly recognizable. Victoria turned to see Meryl Streep approaching, dressed in the center's volunteer t-shirt and jeans, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Beside her padded Thor, the magnificent Tibetan Mastiff, looking completely at home among the rescue. "Animals." "I brought the blankets," Victoria said, suddenly feeling shy in the presence of the woman who had inadvertently changed the course of her life. "Perfect timing," Meryl replied. "We're setting up the senior dog section now. Come on, I'll introduce you to the team." As they walked through the center, Victoria was struck by how differently Meryl was treated here compared to the reverence she had received in the Emporium. Here she was simply Meryl, a dedicated volunteer who happened to be famous in another context. The other volunteers greeted her with friendly familiarity, completely without the awestruck deference Victoria had come to expect around celebrities. They approached a section where older dogs rested on beds, their faces grayed with age, but their eyes still bright with life. A woman in her 60s looked up from where she was arranging water bowls. "Diana, this is Victoria," Meryl said. "She brought those blankets I mentioned, and she's here to help with the senior adoption event." Diana's smile was genuine and immediate. "Thank God. We need all hands on deck today. These seniors deserve the best chance at finding homes." She gestured to the blankets. "Those will make their areas look so much cozier. Would you mind setting them up while I finish the water stations?" Just like that, Victoria was given a task, not because of who she was or what she owned, but because there was work to be done and she had offered to help. The simplicity of it was refreshing. As she arranged the blankets in each dog's space, taking care to make them inviting, Thor followed her, his massive presence somehow reassuring. Occasionally he would nudge her hand with his nose, almost as if offering encouragement. "He's taken quite a liking to you," Meryl observed, returning with armfuls of dog toys. "I'm still not sure why," Victoria admitted, smoothing a blanket for her grey-faced Labrador who watched her with gentle eyes. "Animals recognize authenticity," Meryl replied simply. "They don't care about our accomplishments or possessions. They respond to who we are in the moment." The senior adoption event began at noon, drawing a modest crowd of potential adopters. Victoria found herself assigned to introduce visitors to a 12-year-old beagle mix named Charlie, whose owner had passed away. Initially nervous about what to say, she soon discovered that Charlie's soulful eyes and gentle temperament spoke for themselves. "He just wants someone to love," she told a middle-aged couple who had paused at Charlie's enclosure. "He's been through a loss, but he still has so much affection to give." The words emerged naturally, without calculation or performance, and, perhaps because of that authenticity, they resonated. By mid-afternoon, Charlie had found a new home with the couple, who promised to send regular updates. As Victoria watched them leave with Charlie happily settled in their arms, she felt a sense of accomplishment, unlike anything her social media popularity or exclusive event invitations had ever provided. She had helped create a genuine connection, not for status or recognition, but simply because it mattered. Throughout the day, she caught glimpses of Meryl working tirelessly alongside the other volunteers, cleaning kennels, comforting nervous dogs, speaking with potential adopters with the same focused attention she brought to her Oscar-winning roles. There was no hierarchy here, no special treatment, just shared purpose and genuine care. By the end of the event, 7 senior dogs had found new homes. The volunteers gathered in the center's small break room, sharing coffee from Mismatched, mugs and homemade cookies brought by Diana. Victoria found herself included in their circle without question or qualification. "Not bad for your first day," Meryl said, passing Victoria a mug of coffee. Charlie's adoption was no small feat. Senior, dogs are the hardest to place. It felt good, Victoria admitted. Really good. Different from anything I've done before. Diana overheard and smiled. That's because it was real. No filters, no pretense, just making a difference for creatures who need it. As the gathering wound down, Victoria checked her phone for the first time all day. Her social media notifications had piled up, comments demanding her attention, invitations to exclusive events, messages from people whose names she recognized but whose faces she couldn't quite recall. For the first time, the endless scroll felt hollow rather than validating. "Same time next Saturday?" Meryl asked as they walked to the parking lot, Thor padding faithfully beside her. "I'd like that," Victoria replied, surprised by her own certainty. "Maybe I could help with the social media for the center. They have accounts, but the strategy could use some work. I could help more senior dogs find homes." Meryl's smile was warm with approval. "Using your talents for something meaningful, that's what it's all about." As Victoria drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror at the rescue center growing smaller in the distance. The woman who had entered Manhattan's most exclusive pet emporium a week ago, obsessed with status, judgmental of others, defined by her possessions, seemed like a stranger now. The journey ahead wouldn't be simple. Old habits and insecurities wouldn't disappear overnight. But for perhaps the first time in her adult life, Victoria Harrington was measuring her worth not by what she owned or how she appeared to others, but by what she contributed, by the connections she formed and the difference she made, and that, as a wise woman in gardening clothes had shown her, was a standard worth aspiring to. If you enjoyed this story about the true meaning of worth and the power of authenticity, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We have many more inspiring stories that will warm your heart and perhaps change how you see the world. Don't forget to leave a comment telling us what this story meant to you, and we'll see you in tomorrow's special video.